2 hours.
It's an hour at least, so if you're gonna go.
Is it a little too bright up there?
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
Oh, being backlit.
I mean, this is fine with keyboards. Yeah.
I don't think
That's
it's really hard. So for the open question, do you want me to run around?
I have a 6:40 class, so yeah, so I'll have to see that a little further. I'll just use schedule. Yeah, because so I'm a sex therapist and I work in the care board most of the stuff that has
Right.
I don't do open classes. I tried it. I want to go to my school right there.
So is this going to be
Hi, Matthew. Nice to see you again. That's right.
for the last
Amazing. Yeah, must be.
third? Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool.
Yes.
I'm the neuro person, so I'm the one not putting on the odd. Well, because our research is usually because of people, if that's what they tend to freak out when the brain gender identity. In the current world. No, not at all. So I do most of the brain art projects. I work with folks who are working artists and go into classrooms around Portland and Vancouver and talk about brain behavior. Yeah, we love it actually, but I'm also a parent of two teenagers, so I definitely understand a lot of what was going on with adult the brain and sex.
Just letting you guys and gals know that I'm just basically going to say, hey, this is the difference and discussion, and then I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves, just a quick who you are, what your field specialty is, self-promotion is also there. And then we'll start with a Q&A basically, and go from there. I'll run around the mic and say, hey, what's your question?
Yeah, thanks.
I think we should be good. And we good to start? I hope so. You might have to share mics. So can everyone hear them? Test.
Can you hear us?
All right. All right. So, I'm Will, and I'm going to be your MC tonight. Just letting you guys know, there are 5 tables back there that are representing various groups, and I recommend that you go see them before, during, or after this lovely conversation we're about to partake in. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and we will start the Q&A right after.
Okay. My name is Bill Greiser. I'm in the Department of Psychology, and I study neuroscience. My background is actually not on gender, love, or sex, although I have some experience in those areas in my personal life. But I actually studied drug effects on the brain, specifically nicotine effects on the brain and alcohol effects on the brain, which can definitely impact your experiences of, again, gender, love, and sex. And I come from a neuroscience kind of perspective, so I know that there are going to be differences in terms of the approach, in terms of how we discuss these issues. But the one thing I wanted to say right off the bat is that a lot of the neuroscience research is actually kind of limited when it relates to the brain and behavior in the area of sex. In terms of humans, most of the research that the federal government has actually approved for federal funding involves prairie voles and montane voles and other rodents and things like that. So I can bring in that perspective. But I think these guys will probably illuminate a lot more of this issue than I go for it.
I'm Matthew Garretts. I teach sociology out of the sociology department. My background, I started as a sociologist, and then I ended up becoming a sex therapist. So for the last 10 years, I've studied gender and sexualities as far as identity politics, gender movements, things like that. And then for the last 3 years, I've specialized in family therapy, which I'm an MFT therapist, which is basically a sociologist doing therapy. And I specialize in particularly domestic violence in the LGBT community and gender therapy and sex therapy.
Hi, I'm Jamie Ross. I'm a philosopher by original training, and I'm in the Women's Studies Department. I've been at PSU for a very long time and have taught gender and sexualities several times. My area of expertise is in women's health and reproductive technology.
I'm Laura Kelly. I'm a sociologist. I'm in the sociology department. My teaching and research interests are gender, sexuality, work. Some of my recent research has looked at LGBTQ workers, queer families, trans and gender nonconforming transit riders, and I also have research going on about race and gender and sexuality in the construction trades.
All right. That's what happens when you change the volume. So I'm going to now open up the floor to discussion. If you have any questions that you want to ask, then please raise your hand when we are done with the previous discussion or add on to it. I will let the panelists decide if they want to continue with questions or take individual questions. So, anyone have any pressing questions you want to get off your chest or something? All right. That's why we prepared a list for you. Okay, so one of our first ones is, what is your opinion of online dating, Tinder versus OkCupid?
You want me to start?
Yeah. You get to start with this one.
Okay, I have 2 teenagers, and they're not using either of those apps yet, which is nice. So my understanding of Tinder, right, is that it's you kind of swipe, who you want to see, and things like that. So it's very visual, right, and it's actually very rapid decision making. It's like the kind of emotional response, immediate emotional response to the face, to the whatever else might be on the image, actually, and you just swipe. Versus, for example, OkCupid, is my understanding is that you have to. It's like an algorithm that matches your performance on certain, kinds of psychological tests and things like that. So there's a little bit more, I guess, preparation in terms of who you actually are, potentially going to be introduced to through that app. Is that correct? I mean, I'm not familiar with either one. I've actually been married, for the last, 28 years. So, and I know there's issues of, monogamish and things like that. But these apps have never been in my experience. So, so I think, from a neuroscience perspective, the idea that you would actually be matched on more parameters other than just the purely sort of physical parameters and a quick, visual image means there may be a greater potential for, connection with, something that would actually delve a little deeper into and compare answers from two individuals, as opposed to this really quick swipe. One thing I do want to mention though is like having teenagers and seeing like how much of their lives, their social lives, are actually lived online. I think they're probably better able to evaluate a lot of things like in this environment because they have more experience and exposure to it. And they may have actually, not through Tinder, for example, but through other kind of online kind of experiences, made snap decisions or made decisions, and then they've had feedback in terms of like the social consequences of whatever, they got together with somebody, they responded or they texted or they did something. So they may have a better navigation sense. They've actually had social experience in this realm more, and so they may do better in those kinds of environments. So.
I just wanted to jump in there. So sociologists have been looking at this phenomenon of online dating, and they have a couple of different ideas that I think are interesting. So one is that it is different, right? There's something different about shopping for love or sex online in a way that you might shop for shoes, right? That you can sort of categorically disqualify people that meet or don't meet some arbitrary decision. So I was watching someone on OkCupid, and she was telling me, she was talking me through how she like was doing her thing, and one of the questions was, if a baby smiles at you, do you smile back? And so her answer was yes, and she put in the algorithm that if anyone said they wouldn't smile back if a baby smiled at them, she did not want to go on a date with them. And I was like, that seems very specific, right? Like that seems like a very specific thing to rule out a person on just because of that one little thing. So there's something kind of interesting about sort of this, commodifying love and sex in this way. But other sociologists have argued that it's not actually that different. I mean, that we do this process of mate selection, and yes, it's a new technology, yes, we use slightly different criteria, maybe we have more information up front, but is it really different to read through someone's profile for 5 minutes or talk to them in a bar for 5 minutes and make a decision about whether or not you want to see them again? So some sociologists would argue that it's not really all that different than the way that people have been doing mate selection for a long time. So I don't know where I fall on that. I mean, I think there is something kind of interesting about getting to be so choosy about these things, but then you also sort of wonder what happens to kind of the kismet, right? About just being in the right place at the right time, and maybe someone has a characteristic that you would ordinarily have ruled out, but because they're so wonderful in all these other ways, you can overlook the fact that they wouldn't smile at a stranger's baby, or whatever it might be. Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the issues that comes to mind, and I would really throw it back to the audience so I could get some sense of your answers to the question. But it seems to me that the difference between Tinder and OkCupid would be that OkCupid somehow delays intimacy since it appeals more to people who have my color hair than younger people. And I'm wondering what you think about whether or not intimacy is delayed in today's effort to use different forms of technology, whereas OkCupid asks much more intimate, detailed kind of questions. What do you think about delayed intimacy using Tinder as opposed to OkCupid, or any kind of online selection process? Is an effort to delay intimacy, or is it used to make intimacy more possible sooner?
So I would ask what you mean by delayed intimacy. Like as a flowing process, perhaps it delays, but there's also the increased potential of quantity that maybe means each individual instance of intimacy is delayed, but there are more instances of intimacy constantly ongoing. So I'm not sure what you mean, because it could be that intimacy is both delayed and expedited simultaneously.
Right. So what I mean by delayed intimacy is where you feel like you don't want to use those applications any longer, that you feel quite comfortable with the circle that you've created, that you aren't, in a sense, looking for intimacy in friendships or in romantic relationships? So I'm not sure.
I think it depends on what you're defining as intimacy. So if you're just going like for the straight and narrow in terms of like sex,
Yeah.
I think the use and, in my opinion, overuse of technology to find mates actually maximizes people's ability to have sex with like whoever they want, whenever they want. But if you're talking about emotional intimacy, like I think that all of these are related to some extent.
See, and I think that's interesting because we often equate sex with intimacy. But if we think about intimacy as sharing oneself, right? Being able to share self, however you make that. Raise your hand if you've ever had sex and actually felt more distant from that person after sex. Right? Right? So we have to be careful about what we mean. Because like you can have a whole lot of sex and a whole lot of not intimacy. And which kind of leads me to this idea of dating. I'm always fascinated by the ritual of the date, right? Like most of you that are using online mechanisms are now actually going on dates again. This was a cultural trend at one point that faded out for a while. Because most of you used to meet your partners when you were just out with friends, right? Like you'd be out, a little chemistry, you kind of know who's, you see that, so you go flirt, and maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't, but you can go back to your friends and you're safe. Instead of a date, which is, it often breaks down to a sexual interview, right? And it's you and this other person, and it creates this scenario where you're trying to decide, is this a person that I want to go step by step, whatever your ritual of a date is. And so one of the things that's interesting is that Margaret Mead, anthropologist, pointed out that when Americans shifted to a dating model, we became much more fixated on how many dates we could get, whether or not you had sex, how far a date, quote, how successful a date was. And so what I find with online dating is that people are becoming serial daters and then kind of grading themselves on the, quote, completion of a date, however you define that. Whereas research seems to show that you tend to pick partners that you're happiest with when the pressure's off in more of the group setting. So that's one of the things I notice is I get a lot more people complaining about the intense or the sheer volume of mediocre dates or awkward dates and getting frustrated with that part, like the whole ritual of the date itself.
You know, I just think curious from like the drug research perspective of like the rituals that surround, you know, the consumption or the seeking of drugs. Actually, I mean, it's the same networks that are involved in the brain actually that are involved in, you know, seeking out, you know, partners, et cetera. And this is like motivational networks that involve, you know, neurotransmitter. I'm sure many of you have heard of, which is dopamine. And you know, part of it is when you, it's almost like I wonder if those Tinder apps. Again, I'm not directly familiar with it, but like they're images that have been sort of enhanced, right? I guess they're pretty good. They're like, it's like the high fat, high sugar version. Basically, you're zipping through really quickly, and it's not like the actual experience when you're with somebody. It's like taking a drug as opposed to actually, you know, engaging with something with a ritual around it that you build up a great deal of motivation for the actual ritual aspects of it, like, you know, being with the person. You know, talking with the person, you know, learning about the person, as opposed to just like you go right. It's like just injecting into your vein. So, I don't know.
I'm wondering.
Do you have a question? No? All right, sorry.
I'm wondering if there's a gender dimension that we should raise here. I listened to a great NPR program which was describing women's sense of freedom by being more honest, by being able to say, no, I don't want to go out with you again, rather than making up an excuse or not responding after the first date. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around gender distinctions in the use of these sites.
Well, one of the, I was just gonna.
Well, there's this like new dating app that actually is supposed to put the interaction on like the woman primarily, so she's the only one choosing dates, and she can say yes, I will talk to you, or no, I won't. But the male doesn't have any part in that. So,
What do you think of that?
well, it's just interesting because they're saying they want women to be more willing to be the person asking people out. So how is that changing gender relationships, I guess? I don't know.
What do you think of that?
I think it's interesting. There's plenty of dating sites. There's no reason you can't have one that's like that.
Yeah, I was just going to say something along the similar lines that it's interesting how among heterosexual couples that the gender norms are upheld in the online dating thing, that it's disproportionately men who contact women. So it's interesting to hear about a site that's trying to intentionally interrupt that, because clearly that's a thing that's happening. And so again, I sort of wonder, is this really all that different than what was happening prior, right? I don't know. I think that's sort of a little bit of an interesting open question.
I think one of the experiences too that app may negate is that a lot of my guy friends who are on these online dating sites experience the absolute overwhelming loneliness of never getting a message from a woman and not hearing back from women, but I'll get 500 views and messages within a 2-week period. And so for me, I get a lot of dopamine and a lot of positive reinforcement. But for them, they get a ton of rejection. And so I think that the experience, at least in the heterosexual community, is quite different between males and females.
Do a lot of men use that app?
Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, it's actually if you get variable reinforcement and not very often. I mean, it must mean it's very motivating. They want to get. That means it means more if they do get a response.
That's true. And then you can turn that into they would be so excited that you responded that they may marry you. So I mean,
But I think what you were saying about the gender dynamics is important too, because I think, especially for heterosexuals, it accentuates these power dynamics. Because one of the things that I've seen, and it's kind of this consumptive model, we start wrapping ourselves in that idea of how much can I attract, how lovable am I versus how do I love, right? And so I'm always blown away by the stories of females that when they say no, because of that power and entitlement that's often placed in patriarchal heterosexuality, the anger that comes back sometimes. Like, I'm shocked at how often when you do say no, one of the reactions is anger and how dare you. And I see that a lot, particularly on OkCupid. Tinder sets it up so that can't actually happen quite as frequently because of the fact that you both have to match.
Just in regards to that app that you were talking about, I think that that idea makes me a little uncomfortable, because it seems like it's supporting the patriarchal sort of view that, I've never been on Tinder, but the stories that I've heard and the messages I've seen from friends are a lot of overwhelmingly women friends, messages from guys sending really vulgar things or like very overly forward, not appropriate with the situation that they're in sort of messages. And it seems like that app is set up just to keep men on their best behavior, when it should not. We shouldn't need an app for that. It should be about teaching that that's not an okay way to approach people.
And then we'll go with you.
Think in a similar way, like as a gender discourse of authenticity, I wonder if there's value in these apps being a space for resistance and practice in having agency to say no or yes or whatever it may be, and and practice being rejected, as it were, and being accepted as well, but learning to deal with both of those appropriately. And in that kind of way, maybe these apps have some long-term benefit if progress is a thing.
I think a lot of it probably is like that sort of masculine and gender role, but I think part of it too is like the stigma related to online dating anyway. Like pretty much every time I go out with a friend, we notice people that are on like a first date, and most of the time we assume that it's like a Tinder date or like an online date. And I mean, I've heard stories like that from other people. Yeah, as a bartender, it's weird because I totally know all these people on Tinder dates, and there's sort of like this implied like that's pathetic thing behind it. And so I think everybody kind of knows that it's like quote unquote pathetic that people online date. So I think then like the culture of that like scene within it becomes like not serious. And so I think that sort of like lends itself to like these gender roles being like highlighted when we're using like the apps. So it's like, well, I'm not gonna take this serious because nobody else does. And so, you know, maybe I'll just talk to her like she's a piece of meat, or maybe I'll like talk to him like he's pathetic, or whatever it might be like within the actual like online platform.
Do you guys know anybody who met on Tinder and like stayed together for a really long time? Okay. Just like, okay.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that because my impression
that could
was
change the
the
culture.
stigma
Yeah,
was
exactly.
going away, that was sort of shifting. So how many people here are in a relationship where you met your partner online? So like, that's not an insignificant number of people that are here, right? I mean, I feel like the more people that, you know, that talk about that, it's not like you make up some story about how you met in a bookstore or whatever, right? That, I mean, I feel like the more that people are like, yeah, we met online, like I was ready to find someone and I wanted to find someone that was also ready. I feel like that's becoming a much less stigmatized story than in the past.
And what I hear in that is more the cultural shame around vulnerability on a first date, right? Because a first date is this putting yourself out there. So I wonder if the stigma's around first date. And I was thinking about it because I just told this story. I walked into the Liberty Glass, and when I opened the door, there was a young woman there, and she looked up and she like got excited and then recognized me, and I was clearly not who she was waiting for. and you know, I know that look. That's a first date look, right? And so, and I shouldn't admit to this, but I sat not that far from there, and then the person she was waiting for showed up, and so I got to watch this first date play out, and I felt it for them, right? Like you're sitting there like, oh, that question, and like,
That could have been you.
right? That totally could have been me, but what I saw in that instance was excitement and, you know, an apprehension around that vulnerability piece, right? So I wonder if, it's around that, what a first date is.
That's motivating. I mean, like the novelty around it, and actually the fact is that both of them, you know, supposedly swiped that or something like that, wanted to make this connection. So there's sort of anticipation, and all of that can, you know, heighten the engagement and, you know, the potential for something, you know, positive to happen. So, yeah.
But first dates are the worst, right?
Oh,
like
terrible.
one of the worst parts of life, right? Like that first date, yeah.
And we decided to go back to that model. Like that's what,
That's what's interesting about the online dating is that there's so many more first dates, right? Like, so I had a friend in graduate school who was ready to get married, and so she went on one of the, you know, Match or whatever, and she would like professionally date it. She went on like 2 to 3 dates a day until she found her dude. And so like that's so many first dates, and like I think the thing with online dating is, you know, you have to sort through a lot of nopes before you find someone that might be acceptable. So I think it kind of changes that dynamic a little bit from the, you know, like the exciting, like this could be the one, to like, oh God, I hope this person isn't a serial killer. You know, like I feel like it's sort of
doing the safety text.
you're like downgrading your expectations for first dates. Yeah.
I was just thinking, in some ways, like I figure, like this is new to me. I mean, this is not. I mean, not now. It's not new, but you know, when I met my husband, it was 28 years ago, and so we still had phones that were corded and attached to the kitchen wall. so I mean, it's kind of like, and it was very serendipitous. You know, I walked into this office, and there he was. And so I mean, and then we decided we'd go out, and it was a wonderful first date. I had a great time actually, and I didn't text about it. I wasn't distracted during it. I didn't have a phone out. So I wonder a little bit. Part of this that interaction with the other individual actually is very motivating and gratifying. And there's actually when you have positive social interactions, there are, in addition to sort of dopamine, is one of this classical neurotransmitter we talk about, there are other hormones that are released as a part of positive engagement with others, including some very important ones one called oxytocin and one called vasopressin. And this is what I was kind of curious, because again, the research from the neuroscience perspective is all in these rodents and their use of these hormones, or the release of these hormones. But they're released when you have sex, actually when you reach orgasm in particular. But they're also released when you are in other significant bonding situations, like when even the voles that are, supposedly the promiscuous voles, when they give birth and there's lactation, this is the hormone that sort of encourages lactation, and that also alters, distribution of certain receptors for these hormones in the brain and changes their behavior to be sort of more bonding, directed. And so just good social engagements with people, and then if you do have sex, that actually, promotes even more, kind of connection with those individuals. So, I think an opportunity to engage socially, and I don't know, but I think the jury's kind of out on these things. So I see my kids, and they're like on this all the time. This is and this is a huge part of their social life. So I'm sure when they get a certain text or they get a certain Snapchat or whatever, there is oxytocin release. They're having a conversation. They're having an interaction, but it's just not as familiar. And I don't know if this does change something in some way. I think the jury's still out, but.
There was a question over there, and then I wanted to redirect the conversation back to this gentleman's comment about learning when you're practicing online.
Oh, it wasn't really a question, it was just a comment about there's several comments that came to mind while you guys were discussing. One about the stigma about online dating. I do feel like it's kind of gone down. It just depends on what site you use to find your date. I do have friends and family friends who found people through Facebook or Match, and it's totally fine. But then if you say oh, I went on a Tinder date, it is that oh, you did a Tinder date. And I'm not I have a lot of guy friends who are on Tinder, but to me their reasons seem very materialistic. They're just looking for a quick hookup, the appearance of the girl's face. And when it comes to I want them to come on the whole first date thing. One thing I really notice is I feel people almost skip over the whole becoming friends first. I'm dating someone right now, put out like that, and it just happened. I had no intention of dating this person. We were friends, and then we went out just hanging out as friends, and there was none of that first date awkwardness. And I feel a lot of times in someone when people go into first dates, there's this list of things that should happen, or it's you're completely skipping just trying to get to know someone, and you're sitting there looking at can I marry you? It's how are you gonna picture marriage when you only met this person for 2 seconds of your life? So I feel that's a big part of what happens with the whole first date. Oh, this was a bad first date. Was it really a bad first date, or did you just put all these expectations on it and you just didn't enjoy your
anxiety
time
around
with
those
this person?
expectations?
Yeah.
When dates create a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
Right? Dates create a swipe left or swipe right. Right? You're you just sneezed funny. Womp. You're dead in the water. And I generally, when I have clients that are really struggling with loneliness and they're looking for relationships, I generally recommend group things like Meetup. And I will say this about online venues is that things like OkCupid, you can cultivate sexual identities in the way that we couldn't before. You can identify as sapiosexual, demisexual, poly, non-monogamous, all of this. But you can also find meetups that cater to your identities, and you can cultivate community and happen to find chemistry and connection. And I tend to recommend to do that because it's not that urgency that you have on that date where you're staring at someone across the table or whatever and trying to decide if you're going to get married.
So I wanted to enhance that and go to your comment about educating yourself by going through this process of clarifying what you're wanting, what you're looking for, what didn't work before, what you want now. And I think that's a very powerful process. I did it without Tinder or any of these other sites, but I assertively made determinations given my interactions, and then I learned what didn't work and what did work. So I find the anonymity of the online platform to be extraordinarily high potential for self-reflection.
I had a question from some of the things you mentioned earlier. I was wondering if there's a degree of exhaustion that comes from going after dates, after dates, after dates. And like you said initially, when some people go on dates, there's that degree of excitement of, oh, it's a first date, as but I wonder if that goes away after, you know, severe serial dating after, and if it becomes more of like, ugh, another date, you know, kind of
Yeah.
like an exhaustion, almost like a negative reaction to it.
Like a dependence.
Yeah,
exactly, yeah.
it's no more
Yeah.
sufficient. It's almost like a negative reaction, like, oh, this is just another day. And almost you have like almost like a negative perception to it even before the date begins because of that exhaustion of prolonged serial dating of so many negative, you know what I mean?
But you still engage in it?
Yeah,
though?
but you still engage in it.
It's like it is like a dependence then to some extent, where it's no longer as pleasurable or enjoyable, but you're sort of compelled to participate in the ritual. Yeah. Yeah, that's very.
I was thinking about what you said about cultivating self and intention. I think when we look at the rules of types of gender, like patriarchal masculinity and emphasized femininity, things like this, I think one of the things I see a lot, for example, when I work with people that identify as sex addicts, addicted to sex, one of the common things is that they get trapped in what's called a ritual of avoidance, where they look for external validation to elevate self. And so if we're not clear about what our motivations are, we can get ourselves into a cycle that actually deflates self more, and then we become even more dependent on just to get to a baseline of normalcy. We have to have this high that is coming from this interaction.
You need the drug.
Yeah.
But it's not as enjoyable as it was in the past, right? Initially. Yeah.
And I want to make a very clear distinction between having lots of sex on a principle, like because that's what you value, versus getting into an addictive pattern, which is usually fueled by and not reflecting on what's motivating those behaviors.
You know, so part of it is these networks that are involved in, you know, the development of a dependence are actually, you know, there for a reason. And, you know, to become dependent on somebody is great. I mean, if that's a positive relationship, and you can sort of grow together, and, you know, maybe, you know, you develop rituals, you know, that are part of that relationship, but you also change things. You do things differently, and you add novelty, and you make it interesting as you continue with that relationship. It can you know, persist for a long time. That's healthy, because especially if you have children, and then, you know, you want to be there for the kids. Oh, there's all these other motivations that can kind of, you know, it's never the same. It's always changed. There's something new all the time, and that's actually very positive. It's the same way we become dependent on food. You got to eat. I mean, you got to be motivated all the time, and you don't get tired, you know, of eating. You know, that's more food. So it's when these things go wrong, I mean, in unhealthy relationships and things like that, that's a big problem. Right?
So another question.
I have a question to the sex therapist. When somebody comes to you with sex addiction, how do you work with them? Like, what do you do to undo that?
That's a big question. It tends to be idiosyncratic. Everybody's addiction comes from their personal trauma. I think generally, well, I always start with all my clients. I always do a detailed sex history, and really, I identify more on the humanist form. So I think one of the key values is to figure out what are your intrinsic goals, and what part of, so as a family therapist, one of the major beliefs we have is the majority of depression and pain that we feel is really due to larger cultural systemic issues of racism, sexism, classism, heteronormativity, things like that. So I'd say a third of my clients that come in as sex addicts aren't actually addicted to sex. They've internalized that oppression around shame and sexuality, that they've been taught that they shouldn't feel the desires they do or act on their desires. And then I would say a chunk of them are men really trying to adhere to this cultural standard of what it means to be a man in this culture, which, you know, you talk to any man, nobody can, we all fail at that message. And so sex becomes one of the ways to validate that. So it depends on the person's trauma and their relationship to sex. I don't know if that's the most satisfying answer.
Question way back there.
So I was wondering, when it comes to love and sex addiction,
time one person doesn't like it.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to categorize behaviors, and it would seem to me that it crosses over the minute it's not satisfactory.
Or disrupts the other things you need to do in your life, right? Like
Yeah.
sleep or work or other relationships.
Yeah, I think of drug, like substance abuse disorders, actually, it's the same kind of definition, like, where it's compulsive use, persistent use despite, social, significant severe social consequences to family, to jobs, to relationships.
Isn't it infatuation a little bit like that though? Where
Oh, yeah.
it kind of overtakes you for a while and it can last years.
Yeah.
From what I understand.
Yeah.
So that's why I have a hard time understanding when it crosses over from an infatuation where they consume the thought into something that is addictive.
One of the most beautiful books I always recommend is All About Love by Bell Hooks. I think it's one of the most articulate ways to describe the difference between love and what would be kind of limerick or crushes, where our culture, think about what we say about love in this culture. Love at first sight. Like, how do we know anything about anybody, right? I love exactly everything you need to be for me before I get to know you, right? And so we are a culture that often rewards crushes and this idea of lightning striking and just really kind of objectifying love and putting that on the object versus cultivating. For example, someone was talking about being friends first, things like that. So I think infatuation can certainly turn into love if we really cultivate those values around what it is to cultivate love and respect, caring, things like that.
Question for you?
I was wondering, going along with the theme of being online and also sexual addiction, it kind of got me thinking about how we are all, how porn is super available now, and it's everywhere online, anyone can get it, and it's affecting our culture, and it's affecting our gender identities, and I was kind of wondering, and it's affecting how we interact with sex and what our expectations are, and I was wondering what you guys thought about all of that. Like, how is porn affecting our culture?
I don't think it's the only thing that's affecting boundaries that you may be referring to. I'm not quite sure what boundaries you're referring to, but it seems to me that it isn't clear what porn is. And we can no longer use the definition of I know it when I see it. And I think that keeping those kinds of boundaries porous is a good thing. Again, as idiosyncratic as an infatuation might be, so is one's preferences. And if we're trying to move away from policing the boundaries of desire, then it's hard to say that whatever you mean by porn may be affecting the boundaries of sexuality and love in ways that are problematic, and I'm not sure, because it's too general for me.
Sorry, Mark.
Sure. I was just going to add to what Jamie was saying, in that I think that all of the things that some find problematic about pornography, objectification of women's bodies, violence towards women, promoting unrealistic body types for both men and women, promoting unrealistic sex acts, those sorts of things, that's all pervasive throughout our culture. And it's sort of easy to look at porn and be like, okay, this is where this is happening a lot. But certainly those messages are pervasive throughout our culture. So I think that there's this larger question about what are these messages we're getting about sex and sexuality that may not be individually empowering or helping us move towards a project of greater gender equality. So I think that it's hard. I always sort of, I think it's easy to sort of point the finger at porn, and there's particular examples that are just very distasteful, and we can say like, yes, this is what misogyny looks like. But I don't think it's really all that different than a lot of the messages that are coming through in a lot of different ways in our culture. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that it's having an effect. I mean, there have been lots of studies that they've had a sort of hard time, pinpointing that watching pornography causes sexual assault, right? That there just doesn't seem to be a sort of one-to-one correlation there. But certainly we can't deny that having all of these visual images of violence towards women in our broader culture isn't shaping, how people think about these issues, normalizing those kinds of ideas. So, I mean, I think that for me, that's the larger issue rather than the specific, video or still images of people in sexual acts.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's about disrupting narratives. So these narratives that it's acceptable to be violent towards women. For example, I do a lot of work in the kink and BDSM community, and there is the Pleasure Palace. And so if you've ever watched Pleasure Palace BDSM porn, it is very intense, especially if you've never been exposed to BDSM. But what I love about it is at the end, they have the actors sitting in robes saying like, oh yeah, this is what it was like when when I was the cuckold, and this is what, and they sit and they disrupt the narrative, and they actually point out what it was like to be participants in a consensual act around power and pain.
Right, basically, yeah.
Yeah, and they show that it's performative, and sometimes one of my favorites is to show a clip of pegging porn where it's actually them videotaping the porn, and you see how artificial porn is. So it's how we disrupt those narratives that kind of changes the way we approach what we consume online.
Any comment?
You kind of basically said what I was gonna say. I was gonna expand on what she was trying to mean. I think it was just how and I talked about it. We talked about it in previous classes I've taken, but just how for boys, if they watch porn at a younger age, they start to learn oh, this is what a girl wants, or this is I think that's what you were trying to say with it, that when people are learning this is what oh, when we have sex, this is what a girl wants me to do to her when we have sex, or this is how I'm supposed to act when I have sex, and for the girl it's this is how I should look or behave when we have sex, or if whatever.
Like an instruction manual.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's kind of the same thing we see on how two people are supposed to meet, the whole Cinderella story, oh, my Prince Charming is gonna the whole fairy tale fluff and everything. It's well, that might happen, and it most likely won't happen. It's people look at that stuff as an instruction manual.
Right.
This is how things are supposed to be.
But think about how often do we have honest conversations about our sex lives, right? We are parched for honest conversations. So we're a culture that oozes sexuality, but we never actually talk about it, right? How often do we say, oh, this is what it smelled like? And have you ever gotten this funny discharge, right before, right? I just said the word discharge, and you're like, what? Right? But 90% of your sexual information came from your peers, and they're liars, right? And, I always ask my students, what's the first thing you learned that was not true when you started having a sexual life? And it's this, porn is one of the few places where we get to go explore, and it can be a catch-22. We get to explore identities we wouldn't otherwise be able to, but it also can pigeonhole, and it can also propagate narratives that are very destructive.
I gotta say though, the conversations that you have with your teenagers around this are kind of short. If you use the word discharge, it would be over. So they're gonna go to their peers. But online, there's a lot of information, so you can sort of direct them. So check this out and check that out, and hopefully they look at it.
That's right. I could kind of go either way about talking about discharge, but I am really interested in people talking more about sexual pleasure. And I think that that's what's really missing a lot, right? I mean, particularly women's sexual pleasure and depictions of women's sexual pleasure is missing both in pornography as well as in mainstream depictions of heterosexual sex. And to the degree that, queer sex is presented, I mean, a lot of it is, particularly, sex between women is, a lot, the sort of pornography world is not a very authentic version of what lesbian sex looks like, right? So I think that that's what it's, you know, and as Matthew was pointing out, that we both are, you know, obsessed with sex and sexiness and objectification of bodies, and we're very reticent to talk about sexual pleasure and what we actually like to do, and being able to articulate that to our partners. And there's all this stigma about talking about, you know, the nitty gritty, you know, including the discharge if we must, right? And I think that that's what I would really like to see. And rather than, you know, this overemphasis on saying, oh, we're such a hypersexualized culture. I mean, many people argue the opposite, is that we actually don't talk about sex or don't talk about the most important things about sex.
Honestly, when I work with particularly heteronormative couples, they often come to sex therapy because there's this lack of communication. And the number one thing I do with them is I have all these handouts that I've garnered from the kink community, the BDSM community, the poly community. One of my favorites is yes, no, maybe, right? Like I'll have couples write down, I've always wished this to happen. And the other partner gets to write yes, no, or maybe with a caveat. But like, it's funny that it's often in these, quote, fringe sexual communities where rich discourse around cultivating consensual pleasure is happening. And it's really not happening within the greater kind of heteronormative discourse. It's just, you'll know when you're ready, right? Like that, or it'll just happen. Those are terribly vague messages about how your sexuality is going to play out.
I would agree with that. I think in mainstream porn, which is like kind of clickbait porn, I think there's like a lack of mutuality and sensuality, and it's kind of focused on like, you know, screwing the woman, and just like it's not really about like the body and like all the other erogenous zones that there are. There's not like a lot of talking. There's in fact barely any talking. And so I think that's the problem for me with mainstream porn. I agree that like the whole entire world of porn is an opportunity to sort of like, you know, discover, but people don't know that that exists. And also, quote unquote, good porn, you have to pay for, you know, and you have to be of age. Whereas this other mainstream porn has one, you know, narrative, and like it's free. So.
Going off that and also what you said, I think that what I view as problematic about porn is that we don't have honest discussions about pleasure or actual sex positive sex education for young people, because we're so afraid of sexualizing or of viewing teenagers and younger even sometimes as sexual beings, but they're already looking at sexual imagery. So we're afraid of talking to 12, 13-year-olds about this, but they're already getting all of their messages from their computer or from their smartphones. And I think that, I'm curious if any of you know of any programs that do talk about sex-positive messages with teens that exist.
Yeah, there's definitely resources about sex-positive parenting. Yeah, definitely. And I think, I mean, there's been some really interesting things that have been made it more to the mainstream media about teaching kids about control over their bodies, and this whole idea that it's not okay to tickle a child after they've asked you not to, right? Because it teaches them they don't have control over their body, and so in very age appropriate ways you can teach kids that they have say over what does and does not happen to their body. And then of course, as kids get older, you can get into some more details about consent and more explicit sexuality things. So I think that there are some resources out there, but certainly it's not sort of in the mainstream parenting guides at this point, I would say. Yeah.
Nor any kind of public school.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and then some parents don't want to talk about like what an orgasm feels like to their teenager.
Yeah.
So
We had a biology teacher at Sabin, who was pretty direct and clear to our kids, and they came back and they were very inclusive about sexual orientations, and it was pretty direct. So yeah, it was good. I got the impression that they covered a lot actually, which was
Right, but
unusual maybe, but
but I mean, children, 6-year-olds have orgasms,
Yeah, exactly,
and they don't know what that is.
Right. Oh,
And-
that age. Yeah, I think this is middle school, but yeah. Mhm.
And that's what I think is funny about our cultural values around sexuality. I mean, we're born sexual. Babies do genital rhythmic manipulation, which is
Oh, yes.
masturbation.
Yes.
Infants masturbate. And yet we reserve sexual education for 10, 11, 12 maybe. And a lot of you've already discovered masturbating, yet named it that. But rubbing on the couch, sitting in the bathtub in certain angles while the water's running, you know, it's funny how I think one of the things we really have to fight against is the shame that we often inject into our conversations. Like I would talk to students, how often did you talk to your parents about their sex life? And some of you are like, There's 3 of us that had sex exactly 3 times. That's how many times. Right? So we don't even...
So we've walked in, like, I think, and we just don't say it, it's just natural part of life. I mean, that's not a big deal. I mean, and actually I think they're much more comfortable then. I mean, they're not comfortable that you walked in, but at the same time, that's totally understandable too, but you don't make a big deal out of it, and it's like, that's part of life, you know. It's like, move on. Actually, we did hear it even before this biology classroom. They talked about they were going to get a fappuccino, and they were all cracking up, and I was like, what does that even mean? And that's apparently, the term for masturbation in comics. so we learned about this a little earlier. That's a noise that they claim it makes in a comic, and so they were already joking about this. So they knew all about it. And again, it was more like it's part of life, and then they were much more, and they were comfortable sort of sharing or mentioning it, and then we move on.
Question in the back, and then did you have one, and then
I
go from there.
read there's lots of studies about how healthy it is for us to have relationships because we're creatures who love that social interaction, and also sex and all the health benefits of all that. What happens to people who are asexual, or people who decide that they don't want to have that intimate relationship anymore? Is there really a health decrease from that because they're not having that interaction? I mean, even if they're having their own orgasms, is there a health benefit to that? I just kind of wonder, because I don't see a lot about people who maybe have chosen not to, and I know that as I was also reading that as women now in this new age get older and get divorced, a lot of times they're not getting remarried, and they're they're probably watching porn and masturbating more. And I was just wondering if they're healthy too, and if those type of orgasms are just as healthy as the ones that we have.
Well, as distasteful as it may be to understand your parents' sexuality, it seems to be as distasteful to think of older people having sex. And I think that conversation is now becoming much more popular with terms like cougars. And
they're in their 40s. I'm just kidding.
So again, just disrupting these narratives that existed only because you didn't talk about them, not that the phenomenon didn't exist. Yeah.
Most of the studies actually that look at like mortality risk and like socialization, et cetera, look at like large groups. They're large group studies. So there could be all sorts of outlier populations in there where people who maybe get more anxious, if they are engaged, sexually with others, for example, it wouldn't be beneficial to them. It may actually, cause more stress and make their lives less, healthy in some ways actually than if they're more comfortable in the situation that they've got. Just because they're not having sex doesn't mean they're not necessarily in a relationship with other people or they're engaged in their communities and things like that. So we find, like, for example, like this is like from the drug literature, but like with alcohol, people who consume moderate levels of alcohol tend to have lower mortality risk, and it's largely thought that it's less the alcohol specifically that has more to do with the increased socialization, because it reduces inhibitions and they get together with others and they engage socially, and that's very positive and healthy. And the only other study I was trying to look at, like studies that relate to questions that might pop up that had a sort of a neuroscience basis, but one of them was about like regular orgasms. For this was just in men they were looking, but they were saying it actually reduces your risk of prostate cancer. So there's a number, and it actually improves like sort of cardiovascular health. So, I mean, again, these are all benefits, right? Yeah, but not necessarily with a partner. It's just with just regular orgasms. But yeah.
And I'd argue with your question, it's kind of like the alcohol example. I think sometimes those data are used to support normative assumptions that you need to couple, that you need to be having lots of sex, and that you need to be in a monogamous marriage, right? And a lot of the research around it, the benefits is actually in community, in social connection. And for example, marriage studies show that generally men do benefit from marriage in various ways, but women only benefit in healthy marriages. So if it's an unhealthy marriage, their health plummets. So marriage isn't healthy for everybody, depending on how that's constructed. And single people live healthy, happy lives when they cultivate community. Yeah. So I always ask the question, imagine, because we are one of the loneliest cultures. Americans, UW did a study a few years back showing that Americans tend to be incredibly lonely, and the reason why is we're incredibly isolated. We put all our psychological eggs in the relationship basket. And so we don't often imagine what your life would look like if you put as much energy into your friendships that you would in a relationship, like called them as frequently, had dinners with them, cultivated that intimacy. That would be a very different kind of friendship than what we often experience is what I call activity buddies. Like we tend to connect with people through activities, consumptive patterns like rock climbing or what we do with friends at work, things like that.
Yeah, I just kind of want to talk maybe a little bit more broadly about asexual identities and experiences. This is one of the reasons I love studying the area that I do, is that there's always new identities, new experiences that kind of come on the scene, that this was not on the syllabus 5 years ago, and now this is something that I talk about. So it's exciting to see the evolution of new communities and identities. And I think, so asexual folks who have no or little interest in sexual relationships is interesting, although it's probably not really new, right? Like there's probably always been people that were not interested in having sex. So the recent invention here is this idea of this being a particular kind of person that takes on a particular kind of identity. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, that this is something that's probably always happened, but now it's new because we're calling it something in particular, and people are starting to organize in communities. And I think that some of the the misconceptions are, so asexual people may masturbate, may not. They may have sex with partners, even though they're not necessarily sexually attracted. They may have sex to maintain romantic relationships. There's lots of ways that people experience those asexual identities. So I think it's a really super interesting kind of new way of thinking about sexuality that does really start to, I think, raise some larger questions along the lines of what Matthew was saying about, what is we sort of in our culture we put this importance on your soulmate, who is your primary or only romantic and sexual partner. That's the person that you go to for everything. And I really, to follow up on what Matthew was saying, I think that it is really important to think about the ways that we can have intimacy with folks outside of sexual relationships, and cultivate friendships, and not sort of put all our eggs in that one basket, but think about all of the people in our lives that meet our needs in various ways. So I think that it's actually a very subversive idea, and that's really disrupting the idea that you need one other person to be your romantic sexual partner in order to be complete. So while it certainly is, a legitimate identity and experience in and of itself, I think it also has these larger implications for thinking about what is the role of sexual and romantic relationships, and how do we fit those into our broader map of relationships.
It occurred to me when you were talking, Maura, that this notion of increased number of identities seems to simply legitimize a conversation around a practice that has already always been there. And it's just an interesting phenomenon that somehow the labeling or the new identification legitimizes the conversation.
and maybe this helps in some ways too, because it connects people, you know, to communities that are, you know, small in number maybe, or yeah, they can find out, get information.
Yeah, and if you're marginalized, it's helpful to
Right.
find others
Absolutely,
that share
yeah.
those experiences.
Definitely.
Did you have a?
It was already addressed.
Okay. Then. And we'll get you next.
I wonder if we're aiming too low by striving for health and sexuality instead of beautiful sexuality or whatever else it could be called. Something more than just this is how we have romantic sexual relationships that are non-destructive and into a conversation that's everywhere, including in public schools, sex education that talks about this is how we strive for relationships that are meaningful and worth the pursuit, and et cetera.
I think it's a great idea, yeah.
Yeah, and I think in many people's ideals of what comprehensive sex education would be, it's not just about sex, it's about relationships, it's
Right.
about intimacy, it's about, you know, all of the things that you're referencing too. And I think that it's not surprising that's missing from sex ed curriculums because it's missing from our broader cultural discourse.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Alright, so my question relates back to the short discussion that I think Jamie and Laura were just talking about with identities. And my question is, so it seems like culturally we've definitely moved to a place where we're moving away from the binary and really like interrogating it, but on the flip side creating a slew of new categories in and of themselves, both in gender identity categories and sexual identity categories. And I wonder what your perspectives are on the potential consequences of all of the new identities that are now available in terms of individuals' identity development and their expectations in relationships with how we're like redefining love and sex. It's a big question.
It is.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, you know, identity politics as a field or as a movement in the 1990s was, I think, completely strategic for political gain. But it as a practice, I think, is quite limiting. So, as I said earlier, I think that the benefit of the labels legitimizes the conversation that needs to take place. But that's quite different than using an identity as a political tool to make policy change. So I see the advantage of identities, and yet I think labels are not constructive in terms of broadening the boundaries of conversation, but it does legitimize bringing up, you know, what do you consider the definition of this label to be? So there are advantages and disadvantages, but one's identity, sexual and gender identity, is very different than the identity politics that were used in the 1990s to strategically legitimize gay and lesbian livelihoods, for example.
So what would you call what's happening now with like the creation of various different categories to describe things outside of like the binary for gender identity and sexual identity? You know,
I don't see the political strategies working very well. I do see the benefit of that in opening the conversations. And it would be wonderful to see more of those identities being used for political gain, for policy change. But I don't see that happening.
I think it's going to happen, because I think the same thing back in the 90s. I mean, it seemed like you would never see these kinds of shifts in terms of, you know, gay and lesbian relationships being, you know, legally recognized and all that kind of stuff. And now it's like, you know, with this whole battle over, you know, marriage equality, my kids were like completely confused. Like they're like, "What is this story? What is the deal? Why this is like an old person problem?" And I think we have to sort of move things. And the same is true, I'm sure, with like trans identities and things. I mean, that's going to all. I mean, that's right now. Even I think there's greater visibility when you have the labels. You know, you can actually have people who are more visible and they're more present, so you know people. And you know, when these issues come up in, you know, like a political discourse, you attach actual individual people to those ideas, and it's no longer an abstraction. It's actually, oh no, that's that person, or that's that person. And so I think it's really helpful in some ways. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I have sort of mixed feelings about it. I mean, I think on the one hand, it is legitimate to say that if expressions of gender and sexuality are perhaps infinite, then why would we expect there to be only 3 or 4 boxes for people to be able to check? And it seems reasonable that people would find those limiting and want to suggest new ways to identify that feel more authentic. And so certainly on a interpersonal level, I defer to whatever identities people prefer to take on for themselves. But I do share some concerns also, along with what Jamie was saying, is the sort of fragmentation and sort of some of the infighting is pansexual better than bisexual? I mean, I think it's getting caught up in those kinds of identity policing debates, I think can be detrimental to the cohesion of collaboration across these different groups and recognition of shared grievances based on gender and sexuality. So I mean, I think that there's some concerns politically. I think that it also can be a little tricky for allies. I see this a lot in classes that I'm teaching, that we sort of have these ever expanding list of terms, the demisexual and heteroflexible, and some of these folks that are encountering these terms for the first time, they're just like, I don't know what are we doing, help me, right? And so I don't think that deferring to cisgender or heterosexual people is the way to go, but I mean, I think that we have to take into account that if our language is being so fragmented that we only can speak among ourselves and we can't speak to a broader audience about who we are and what our concerns are, then I think that can be that can be tricky. Yeah.
So that's when I think that it's much more important to talk about preferences rather than labels. What do you want? What do you want? What do you like? What do you don't like? And less focus on trying to categorize those preferences.
So we had a question up there, and then we'll get to you.
It seems to me that a lot of the angst around sexuality in contemporary society, in our contemporary society writ large, has to do with the separation of spheres and the sort of fragmentation of life, by and large. For instance, you mentioned having all of these different categories where the list grows, so long, it's like learning your ABCs all over again, which doesn't help anyone, and in fact angers people because they're frankly like, I don't care anymore, right? Apart from the people who are that particular letter in the alphabet. But at the same time, it's also creating a division, right? You have LGBT, and it goes on, right? And I don't even know what the current state of it is. But at the same time, it's saying, okay, we are a community, because the word is sometimes used, LGBT community, whereas it's not in fact a community, right? You don't have like a gathering place, like this is the church of LGBT whatever, right? It is in fact individuals in a society, in a community, right? And that excluding heteronormative, whatever you want to call that, people from that is in fact perhaps not the way to go. And similarly, a lot of this conversation has seemed to fail to integrate female sexuality. It seems like even when it wasn't spoken, the idea was that male sexuality is still the norm. And in discussions of whether polyamorous, polygamous, I mean whatever, again with the labels, I think it's perhaps unhelpful because it's this constant fragmenting of what is in fact more of a unified whole of human experience and a cultural whole, because we in fact do live in a culture, and we live in, for instance, a country called the United States, right? And that changes depending on where you are, and narratives are millionfold wherever you are on Earth, but you can still sometimes take averages, and you can still say that no, we are in fact a society, and it seems like creating those divisions within that, or divisions between even fields studying the aspects thereof, like even having a panel, I think, where you're going, well, from my field, my perspective seems slightly problematic when really it's a question, and it's, my opinion is this based on what I've found. If that makes sense.
We label and divide up, that's what we do actually though. I mean, like in every sphere, not just in sexuality. I mean, before we talk about Tinder versus, you know, this is what and they all have, I mean, that's just, you're never gonna stop people from doing that actually. But part of it is, I think with sexuality, I mean, clearly from the neuroscience perspective too now, I mean, the development of areas of the brain that are involved in gender identity, you know, sexual orientation, sexual expression, all these are it's such a complicated, you know, kind of developmental process that takes place over a lifetime, you know, over like large portions of our life, that there's a great deal of evident diversity. I think what's kind of nice is that, you know, with these labels, with people coming out and being very clearly present as, you know, no, I'm a little different here, I'm a little different there. I mean, it makes that obvious, that always present diversity that we were talking about, evident to more. So, you know, when Marco Rubio is walking around in New Hampshire and somebody's, you know, some guy turns to him and says, hey, you know, I'm gay, get out of my face, you know, go away. I mean, you can have, there's this whatever, the heteronormative is the way we talk about it, but there's a certain kind of cultural approach that just doesn't hold water anymore. And the nice thing having teenagers, and maybe this is partly we're in Portlandia, I mean, is that, you know, they just look at it, everybody looks at it in their school, they're like, what is going on? I mean, how ridiculous is this? I mean, obviously there's a great deal of diversity, and it should be to some extent sort of celebrated. And it's based in our biology and our culture. So it is what it is, so get used to it.
The issue around categorization, I think, is something that we can talk about in a way other than let's get used to it. I think categorization is useful. It helps us do things. But our concept of categorization is fixed. And none of these categories are fixed. They are all fluid. And not only are the categories fluid, but our desire to make one category more important than another is also fluid. So me being a lesbian in this environment is much more important now than me being a lesbian tonight. Okay, so not only is it not necessarily of equal value here and there, but what it means here is going to be different than what it means when I'm in another environment where it's as important. So the context of these categories is what's more important, not getting rid of the categories or there are too many categories and there's power to the categories. Yes, but it's what your goal is. So I'm very pragmatic about the necessity that the boundaries of these categories have to remain fluid, and yet they're very useful, sometimes more successfully than others.
Question there, and then I'll to you.
Yeah, I generally agree that the categories have a useful, they're defined in a certain sense by their usefulness. I wonder if the reliance on the category in the long term always reinforces the notion that there is such a thing as a specific category of individuals that is not meritorious of consideration.
Well, the value of the category is to use it and then let it go. It's like going up a ladder. You got to take your foot off the rung in order to get up to the next rung. You got to get off your perch. You can't hold on to that category because it doesn't have infinite use.
So what we're aiming for is that we're all part of the human category to some extent. I mean, like in some ways, like, I mean,
depends why
because
you're saying
if you're
that.
Categorizing this person, these people to then dismiss them, right? I mean, and I don't know, that's what you were sort of referencing. Like you can sort of, you put people in a category and you can sort of dismiss. I mean, the idea is that actually, no, these are actually, look at, this is like Joe, or this is an actual individual that I know, and they're human, like I am. That's the funny thing, like with this whole, the terminology and the categories are important. I agree with you, because in the sense that like, when they talked about the marriage equality issue in Oregon, the Oregonians used to drive me crazy. They talked about like, it was gay marriage, when really we're talking about marriage, is what we're talking about. And you reach a certain stage, and then drop the gay. I mean, like, and in fact, you have more connection with people who are married. and or people who are children.
That's a really good example of
Yeah.
where you have to understand, well, what's the
How do you
goal?
get there? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Why would the Oregonian say gay marriage? Why would you say, no, just marriage? You have different goals.
Yeah. Mhm.
And so the categories have different meanings, and they have to stay flexible, otherwise you're talking cross purposes with people. So it's more important to understand to say, well, what does that category do for you? Why are you using that? What's your goal in using that label, that category? Because then I can get on board with you and I don't have to disagree with you if I understand what is the goal that you're trying to achieve by using these categories. And
we use the question and we let it go, or we don't solve it, we get over it. But what happens if we never do that? I mean, it doesn't seem like we actually, in general, I don't see people discharging the categories that they used for a purpose and then letting go.
that's right, because we have a very fixed notion of categories as fixed entities.
That's to some extent what I was referencing, is not the idea that you don't at some moment categorize something, or for the fact of, say, classification, just like in natural science, you say, oh, that is in fact, camellia plant or whatever, right? But I think what was different is the idea that these categories do have to and must always exist, whether it's, a human category or a so-called natural category, but.
Blame it on Aristotle.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this was a major breakthrough, that we could create categories. They're useful.
It's how the brain works too. It's how you kind of you categorize. I mean, it's a way to make quick judgments, right? And you put something into a category. You don't have to think about all the details that may make it a little different than an exemplar of that category, for example.
But isn't it also important that in a way that we are categorizing, because in a sense, it does break down that normativity, and I guess for the newer generation, it's like, oh, now there are these things, and there are more things being added to the list, and what are the older generation, or even some people nowadays think or consider to be normal, are not really normal, you know what I mean? And although biologically we're kind of, in a way, are used to categorizing and systemizing things, I feel like it also brings about a conversation of when more things are being added to the list. Oh, okay, so are you cisgender, or are you, or are you gay, or are you lesbian, or what are you? And then I think it also brings the conversation to the forefront, where now people are able to explain, what they really feel, or who they really are.
People are required to explain what they mean. And we have to get into the habit of asking people, what do you mean? Rather than make the assumption, I know what that means, or I don't care what that means.
It's how communities sort of define themselves too, to a certain extent. I think of my kids, they definitely have their own categories that are harder to figure out, and maybe it's not intentional, but they love it. Like when you don't get the categories that they're talking about, and you're like, oh, you don't understand, this is how the world is working. Every generation, forms their own way of looking, their own language around, these things to some extent.
It's strategic.
It's strategic, yeah, exactly.
They don't
It's the
want
way they
you in
build
their
up their,
face.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's strategic.
Yep.
So the most important thing is to say, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Not, what's your identity? That's my very short answer to the question a long time ago, of what you think about categories.
Yeah, could you talk about integrating your sexual drive into your higher self? And our society seems to not talk about that too much. You hear a little bit about sublimating your sexual desire in sports, maybe artists develop that ability somehow. I don't know if that's something you have to train yourself to do, but that's one way of expressing your sex through sexuality, through maybe spiritual, artistic.
Yeah, definitely. So with experience, right? You actually, you learn. You actually change, your expectations about how various encounters will go, or how you. And part of that involves actually, in some cases, inhibiting, certain behaviors under certain circumstances. And again, with younger people, they're learning that, and that's one of the things about. This is true of any area of sort of social endeavor or social engagement, is that the way you get to a point where you actually feel comfortable and you have a community that you feel, you are expressing your sexuality and other aspects of your personality and behavior in ways that that get you where you want to be. You have to make a lot of mistakes and errors, and you have a lot of first dates and a lot of things that don't go well, actually. And things can go terribly wrong, actually, under certain circumstances. But that's how you actually learn. How you rewire, big portions of the frontal lobe, actually, that link up, sort of stimuli that are associated with, the power dynamics in a particular situation, the behaviors you're witnessing from others, memories. You're often accessing, past experiences, not always consciously, but they're giving you a little bit of a guidance system, like this feels right or this feels wrong, actually. And you can utilize that sort of navigation network that you develop through hard work, trial and error, lots of mistakes, lots of errors, actually, till you get to a certain point. But one of the things that I think we're talking about the categories and everything too, is that the rules change. The social rules change, the social expectations change. So behaviors that were once not acceptable are now, absolutely. I mean, different things change. Things change, and that's a learning process, and that's hard for, one generation maybe that's, kind of internalized a lot of these rules, or they have certain expectations. They feel they have a role in imparting this on to the next. They get challenged all the time.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the goal, right, sexuality, right, is really in some ways the perpetuation of the species and the formation of, bonds and connections that allow for, like, kind of healthy societal development, like the most, that make us the most, we are all everywhere on the planet, right? We've made it everywhere. Where we've multiplied. I often think, like, in terms of our, sexuality and the expression of sexuality. When I was born, there were 3.5 billion people, and now there's 7.3 billion people. So, these, we've done a lot to kind of, like, organize our behavioral responses, in very complex situations, and in ever increasing complexity given the size of our cities and the size of our communities. But we've been remarkably successful, as a species. So.
But a great environmental cost.
At great environmental cost, yeah. You look, it looks like the growth of bacteria in a petri dish. Essentially, yeah, it sort of bloomed out in various places. So.
I have a question about, like, research methods in humans. So I'm a biology major, and I know that you can study sexual behavior in rats by, like, making a male rat go over, like, electrified grid to see how badly he really wants this female rat, and why, like, what is there seems to not be, like, a human counterpart, and why, and what do I need to do to get funding or, like, acceptance to do that on humans, like, why
there's a wonderful book, I forgot her name, but Bonk. She wrote Stiff and
Mary Roach.
Mary Roach, yes, absolutely, it's terrific. But there are actually researchers who are doing, for example, even like MRI research on the mechanics of sex, like human sexual intercourse, because they didn't really have much data or information actually about what precisely is happening, and that's a very artificial kind of a situation, and you know that MRI tube is not exactly the most generous space, and you're not supposed to move. so like there are significant limitations, obviously, in studying in humans, and you can't like implant electrodes into the medial preoptic area of a, you know, or in humans it's a different hypothalamic nucleus, but to look for differences in activity. You know, they've done things like, for example, there is a great role of olfaction and sort of sexual attraction in many animals, actually. So they've been very curious, based upon that kind of research, in looking for similar sort of pheromonal cues in humans. And they have identified, like, you know, areas they're actually not in your nose specifically and not in your mouth. They're in a spot between your nose and your mouth. And other animals, actually, if you have a dog, for example, you take it on a walk, and sometimes it'll get down close enough and it'll sort of like pull stuff in. If you're raised on a farm, you'll see animals do this sort of, they're sucking in something, usually around urine and things like that. But they're actually pulling in like chemicals, odorants, actually from, you know, other animals that may provoke a certain sexual attraction, may get them, it's telling them something about who was in this neighborhood, who was here. And it goes into these ducts that are right up above behind the teeth, actually, and it goes to this chamber, and those neurons project into areas that are sexually dimorphic, that are different in males and female dogs, for example, or goats or other animals that, you know, do this. But we have the same thing. In embryonic development, fetal development, they're open ducts, but they close. But it turns out that some of our pheromonal cues actually come from direct kind of contact with another, like kissing, and those chemicals they work their way and they stimulate the exact same pathways. They go to some of the same targets in the brain that differ between men and women, and can generate, you know, different sorts of responses. So. But most of the research is on voles.
Since I do a lot of work in health, one of the problems is the very direct distinction between male and female bodies and how problematic that is in medicine and healthcare. So that
Those are like painkillers, right? Things like that.
Needs to be shifted in order to even begin to talk about individual bodies or individual health.
Thank you, guys.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all so much for coming. Please take some food with you. Looks like there's some there. Thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you so much for coming.
Very nice.
Thank you too.